Hi friends, Mr. Sherman here. Today we're going to talk about the Cold War. The Cold War basically lasted from about 1945-ish to about 1990. And the reason that we get the name Cold War was that theoretically the United States and the Soviet Union never officially declared war on each other. We fought economically and we fought socially and politically and things like that, but we theoretically never declared war on each other and really came to blows. That's why it's called the Cold War rather than a hot war. But probably the most important reason that we should study the Cold War is because it was the #1 foreign policy issue in that whole time period. Everything revolved around the United States versus the Soviet Union. If you grew up in a time period like in the 80s, you learned everything you needed to know about the Soviet Union just by watching the movie Red Dawn. That greatly influenced my life, and it prepared me eventually for a later, much more reasonable zombie apocalypse or some kind of crazy viral pandemic or something like that. But the issue is, the Cold War was really important in American and world history. So let's go back and talk a little bit about the background. First off, it's really important to note that toward the end of World War II, the Soviet Union started to push the Germans back over previously conquered territory, back towards Germany. And what the Soviets did is, as they moved through territory that had previously been conquered by the Germans, they just installed communist governments that were friendly to them as they went. And then they pushed all the way toward Germany, eventually taking over half of Germany. They took over Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, nations like that. And the reason that they did this, it's quite reasonable, is they wanted a buffer zone to protect themselves from the West. They wanted to have satellite states that were friendly to them that they could then basically trade with or kind of keep them like a new form of a colony. They could take their natural resources, which they did. But most importantly, if we ever attempted to invade the Soviet Union, we'd have to go through these Eastern Bloc satellite nations first. All right. And what is important at this point to note is, what the heck is communism? Like, why do we not like communism? Why is it so antithetical to the American way? Why did I grow up hating commie pinkos? I mean, just what's the deal with it? And a very important reason is that communism is godless. They don't allow you to have a religion. And here's the deal. In our country, you don't have to have a religion. It's in our Bill of Rights. We have freedom of religion. We also have freedom from religion. So no one can force you to have a religion. They can't force you to have one. They can't force you not to have one. And that's really annoying to Americans, completely understandable. Next, we didn't like the fact that the Soviet style of communism offered very little freedom, be it social or economic freedom or the freedom to stay out of like Siberian gulags and things like that. Soviet style communist dictators absolutely loved killing their own people. And so we were not terribly excited about having this form of government take root anywhere nearby us. And so what's going to happen is we're going to fight this. And it was reasonable to do so. Now, just so you know, communism wasn't supposed to be like that. When you take a look at like Karl Marx and his idea that the proletariat or the working class would eventually take over. They'd take over the means of production, and then everyone would have what they needed, everyone would be taken care of, and things like that, just didn't seem to work, because all that was really happening was dictators were taking over, and what they were then doing is they were enforcing their form of communism, like Stalin, by creating a secret police, by eliminating people's rights, by creating fraudulent elections and then sending people to Siberian gulags. And so what's going to happen is it's just not going to work. I will tell you, though, that if you're starving, if you're unemployed, or something like that, like literally there's no better option, the idea that to each according to his need seems appealing. And so the best way to fight communism is to make sure that people have a job. It's really quite simple. If you can control the economy and help people out, they're not going to opt toward a Siberian gulag. They're just not going to. All right. So what we decided to do is we are going to adopt a policy called containment. We're going to try to contain communism where it was, kind of like it was a disease, and we're all like social distancing them. And we push them away, and we're like, just don't let it spread. This was by a guy named George Kennan. And this idea can possibly work. We just want to make sure that no other nations, apart from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, really want to be communists. And we're going to do this primarily economically. The next phase is going to be something called the Truman Doctrine. And what President Truman's going to decide to do is he's going to start initially by saying, you know what, we're going to fight the spread of communism and we're going to do it economically. Eventually, it's going to be a shooting war in Korea, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the idea was that we, the United States, would be awesome and successful. We'd have a high standard of living. We'd have a super wonderful literacy rate. We'd be completely modernized, and we would allow communism to wither on the vine. Just let it die off, and everyone will see America is better than withering on the vine. All right, really simple stuff. All right, so what we're going to do in order to try to make all this happen is we're going to create strategic alliances like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is basically the good countries against the communist nations. And NATO is still in effect today, and it still has as its primary role making sure that Russia, they're no longer called the Soviet Union, but making sure that Russia behaves itself. Still out there today, still doing its job. We also created the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, we had failed miserably to figure out Pearl Harbor was happening, and so we decided, you know what, we had the information, we just didn't have a clearinghouse to figure it out. So we created the Central Intelligence Agency to centralize all that data so we could make better decisions and our president can figure out what the heck was going on. Also, we're going to use this time period to pump in an unbelievable amount of money into our military. Initially, it's going to go into land forces, so we're going to put tanks in Europe. But then we realized, wait a minute, we get more bang for the buck with nuclear weapons. And initially, the Soviet Union didn't have them. So if we could put more money into nukes, the idea was we could save American lives, scare the heck out of the Soviets, and we wouldn't have to have a really massive army. We wouldn't have to have tanks and ships, just have nuclear bombs. And so there is going to be a shift toward the Air Force, which was a relatively new organization. So what's going to really freak us out is a couple of things. The Soviet Union are going to detonate an atomic bomb. They stole our information, and their spies were able to use our plans from the Manhattan Project. But the other really big deal was that China fell to communism, and that was a pretty huge shock to us. And so a super big country with a lot of people becomes communist, plus the Soviet Union. There's this obvious fear that the world is going to become communist. That was a really scary time. And the way that we wanted to fight this apart from building up the military, creating an intelligence service and things like that, we decided we were going to build back Europe, build it up to better than it was before World War II. And so we created something called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan gave tons of money, I think it was $13 billion, to rebuild not only our former enemies like Germany, but also our allies. And we figured if we could build them up, if we could create a modern America-like state or states throughout Europe, then there's no way they're going to become communist, because they're going to be really, really happy that they have a high standard of living and they're going to live the American dream. It'll just be French or English or whatever it is. But we'll win because it's better than communism. That was the hope. We also rebuilt Japan. At this point, we need to take a break. Seriously, Red Dawn is an amazing movie. It just is. You should watch it. Well, one of the other things that's going to happen during the Cold War is when the Soviet Union swept through and eventually met the American and British armies in Germany, part of Germany is going to be taken over by the Soviet Union, and basically the eastern half of it. And the other side is going to be taken over by the other allies, the United States, France, and Great Britain. And what's going to happen is the Soviets are going to create a Soviet-style government in East Germany, and it's going to be extremely non-successful. As a matter of fact, it was so unsuccessful that people were attempting to leave it and to go to the good side. And what's going to happen is in 1948, they're going to blockade the highways. And then they're going to blockade the railways. And they're not going to allow any goods and services or anything to come to Berlin, which was within the Soviet sphere of influence. But we were supposed to supply it and protect it. And the Soviets said, well, you can't get there. We're working on the roads. And by the way, we're working on the railroads also, so there's no way you can get there. So they blockaded it, and we couldn't bring supplies to the people of Berlin. The communists thought that they were going to win, and that was when we decided we were going to initiate something called, it was Operation Vittles, I believe, and that was the Berlin Airlift in 1948. And for almost a year, we shuttled everything that the people in Berlin needed, everything that the West Berliners needed, we flew to them. It didn't matter if it was heating fuel, if it was candy bars, if it was paper. Every single thing that they needed, food, water, everything, we flew over. And the Soviets really couldn't do anything to stop it. They attempted to fly their fighter planes near our cargo aircraft. They tried to hit our pilots with spotlights, and our pilots just used sunglasses because pilots are pretty cool. And then we finally told the Soviets, we're like, listen, if you continue to do this, one of our planes might accidentally overfly its target in Berlin and have to jettison its cargo, which might just be a nuclear bomb over Moscow. Hi. And all we had to do was basically send that veiled threat, and the Soviets are going to get it. They're going to understand. And eventually, they're going to back off. Now, in 1961, they're going to put up the Berlin Wall, and we will talk about that later too. But let's talk a little bit about more how the Cold War impacted us. Obviously, there were real shooting wars. You think of the Korean War in the 1950s. You think of the Vietnam War, mainly 1960s and 1970s. But also, we have to think about what influenced people like me and people who are a little bit older than me And that was the idea of MAD, or mutually assured destruction. The idea that the Soviets had the capability of nuking us to the point that we couldn't exist. Therefore, if they wanted to do that to us, we had to be able to get at them too. And so what we had was something called the Strategic Air Command. We had aircraft with bombs in the air at all times. Just in case the Soviet Union launched a strike, we could still get at them. You also might hear of things called like what is it, a dead hand switch or something like that. Even if we get nuked, we can still get back at them, which is scary. But the idea was destroying the world was so unfathomable that there's no way the Soviets would do it. And so it was a form of deterrence, mutually assured destruction. Pretty darn scary. Once we created intercontinental ballistic missiles, it became a whole new story, because a bomber flying can be seen and can be engaged. An intercontinental ballistic missile at the time could not be engaged. There was nothing you could do. You might be able to detect it on radar, but there's nothing you can do once it's launched. So that's pretty darn scary. And so what we started to practice, not me, but people of generations before me, things like duck and cover. And if you've ever seen the duck and cover with the turtle, Bert, I've seen it. But people were trained to hide under their desks, because that gave people a sense of control. Just like we have fire drills and tornado drills and things like that, they had duck and cover drills. All right. The other thing that you should know, there's some pretty cool things that happened as a result of the Cold War. Also, number one, school lunches. Schools never gave lunches out before. It just wasn't a thing. But as the Korean War started picking up, our government realized that a heck of a lot of our American citizens were not eligible for military service because they were malnourished. That means fewer soldiers. That's a real problem. So what we did is the government started instituting lunch programs so that people in poverty-stricken areas of the country had enough food so that we had a ready supply of soldiers. It ended up being a good idea anyway. So another thing, NASA. One of the ways that we fought the Soviet Union was by showing that we were better and smarter and faster and everything like that. NASA was a big deal. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, a satellite, in 1957, this shook us to the core. We had to do something. And so we created NASA, and I don't know how many Soviets planted flags on the moon. The answer is none. All right. We did! We were there a couple of times. So that's a cool thing. And then, I mean, calculators, ballpoint pens, astronaut ice cream, right? That came from NASA. Computers, stuff like that too. The interstate highway system was created in order to get troops and soldiers from one side of America to the other. Also, it allows people to run and hide if there's a nuclear war or something like that. Also, the Cold War is going to create something called the Red Scare, and loyalty tests for government workers. How do you get ahead in a society that's so deathly afraid of communism? Well, you tell on your neighbors, you tell on your coworkers, you narc on people. I mean, you got to think about like your Ronald Reagans and your Richard Nixons. They made a name for themselves by being super anti-commies. It's going to go so far that eventually in 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy is going to become internationally known for a very short amount of time, blessedly, for basically stating, hey, I have a list of a whole bunch of communists that work for the State Department. And he's going to start accusing everyone of being a communist. And so if you didn't kowtow to McCarthy, meaning if you didn't do whatever he said, if you questioned McCarthy, all he had to do was call you a communist and your future was done. because you were soft on communism. It was genius. It didn't work out in the end, in part because McCarthy overplayed his hand and he accused the U.S. Army of being all communists and things like that, and that eventually went a little bit too far. But the most important thing to know about the Cold War is that it was an ideological, it was an economic, it was a social, it was a cultural war against the Soviet Union. And we won. Thank you very much. I hope you guys stay safe and stay healthy, and have a good day. America.